What's up, Internet? This is Josh, and today we're going to learn a little bit about making video games. So, welcome to my intro to GameDev. And I guess this is a tutorial that's kind of motivated by the fact that, I'm someone who's been in the game industry for almost 15 years at this point, and one of the things that hasn't changed in that time is that it feels like there's still this kind of huge number of people, especially online, who say things like, how do I get into the industry? You know, it feels like there's still so many people who want to make games. Maybe they have an idea, maybe they want to get into games professionally, maybe they're just a hobbyist or something like that. It feels like there's just so many people who want to make games, but they just don't know how to take that first step. And so that's kind of the point of this tutorial, is how do we kind of, no matter who you are, how do we, focusing on kind of like the game side of things, how do we kind of start building those game development skills and learn how to make games? Ironically, in 2025, we actually have more tools, more powerful tools, more accessible tools than ever before. You know, compared to 15 years ago, it kind of blows the offerings out of the water. And even before that, that was crazy compared to what we had 15 years before that. So, we're in a place where no matter who you are, you can learn how to make games. The tools that we have available today are pretty amazing. But it's just a question of, if you don't know how to take that first step, it's just still so hard to know how to do it. There's not a lot of formal education around this kind of stuff still. It's still very much a case where if you don't know how to take that first step, then it's not really that much easier than it ever has been. So let's try and kind of figure it out together. Now, if you'll allow me to ramble a little bit for a moment, I think part of what makes this so hard even today is the fact that in order to get into games, we kind of need two separate sets of skills. On one hand, basically everybody who works in games needs to know some amount of this stuff. This is knowledge that is very specific to games that isn't really useful outside of it. So, how does the game engine work? How do we actually make a fun game? What is the right approach to take to actually making a video game? This is all very kind of bespoke knowledge that is kind of specific to the games industry. But you kind of always have to pair it with some combination of these technical skills. So, in order to make a game, you kind of need, at least someone on the team needs to know how to program, basically, right? Someone needs to make the art assets and, all this kind of stuff. So the problem is that, if you are starting from absolutely zero and you don't know anything, then you kind of need to learn this stuff and some amount of this stuff. And that can be very overwhelming. It's kind of like trying to write a book in a language that you don't even know how to speak yet. So let's make it a little bit less overwhelming. We're going to try and start from the beginning and kind of look at, who are you, what are your goals, where you're trying to go, and kind of figure out what is a realistic place to start, what kind of direction can we take, how do we kind of set ourselves on that path. So I think something to kind of point out from the very beginning is that the point of this tutorial series isn't necessarily to be it's not really a programming tutorial or anything like that. I think the idea is we want to kind of focus on these skills. So, based on that, let's kind of start thinking about what do you want to learn? Because that's ultimately the point of this is, nobody's going to make their ultimate magnum opus game from the very beginning. So from the start, our goal is more so we want to learn, we want to kind of start developing our skills. We want to say what kind of game do we want to make? Let's kind of start moving ourselves in that direction, right? For now, if we are someone who has no knowledge or no skills about making games and that kind of stuff, then we want to set ourselves a very simple, a very achievable goal from the very beginning. And the idea is the kind of projects that we want to target are the ones that are kind of going to teach us the things that we want to learn, that are going to kind of push us in the direction that we want to go, depending on what our personal goals are, whether that's hobby, career, I want to learn X engine, whatever it is, right? So today, for this first intro video, we're going to kind of focus a little bit more on that side of things, on the planning elements. And then in future videos in the series, we're going to actually start looking at how do you build a plan to actually make the game and kind of think more about that side of things. So, let's start from the beginning. I think for a lot of people, oftentimes one of the hardest parts is just kind of knowing what to make, right? Even if you have a game idea, it can be really hard to say, like, what is my first project? How do I develop? What should I make to develop those skills? These kind of things. So let's kind of talk about it a little bit. I think the best place to start is always looking at like the kind of games that you're passionate about, the things that you love. They say one of the most traditional pieces of advice for creatives is to make what you know, right? And similarly, if you're someone who your goal is you want to work on FPS games, then you probably shouldn't spend a lot of time thinking about how to build RPGs and platformers and stuff like that, right? Like there's definitely knowledge there for you to gain, but the whole point is thinking about like what are your goals, let's move you towards those goals, right? And similarly, I talked how basically everyone has to have like some combination of these technical skills. So, at the same time, we can, as we're getting started here, I think it's good to start thinking about like what parts of the process inspire you and what skills you want to focus on. And then, based on some of the answers to some of those things, we can start thinking about how to target the right projects that are kind of the right projects for you. But also, like I said, often for a lot of people, this is the hardest part of the process, is just figuring out what to make. So if you're not sure what to make, that's fine too. We're going to kind of come up with a generic idea for what you could potentially target for your first project. So here, before we even begin, let's try and figure it out a little bit, We're not going to design the whole game here, but I think it's important before you even, get started building necessarily, that you have some picture in your mind of what you want to make and what you want to get out of the process. What are you trying to learn? And so that's kind of the point of all of these, learning projects, right? You're trying to develop your skills, and so you should try and kind of design your projects around that. But even before any of that, I think one of the main things to think about is what can you make? Think about what mechanics have you built before, what things do you understand how to do already, what art assets do you have available to you to mix and match and reuse and stuff like that. These are all going to kind of dictate the kind of games that you can make and that are like, simple enough for your skill level and stuff like that, right? Maybe you have this ambitious idea to make like an open world, space metropolis, stock trading game or something like that. Say that's our idea. What we should do is start thinking about like, oh, what do we actually need to make that a reality? How do we actually accomplish that? And it's like, well, I don't think I have the art skills to like create that believably on screen. I don't know that I have the programming skills to create those mechanics. So maybe that is my eventual goal that I want to make one day. But we should kind of like scale down the project a little bit and kind of start thinking about what we can achieve today realistically. When it comes to mechanics especially, like I think it's good to have ambitious goals and like try and have a few things on every project where it's like maybe you don't know how to build it yet, and kind of like those are your kind of like targets. Those are the things you're trying to learn with this project. And then when you go on to the next project, you can kind of like take that knowledge and kind of like start mixing and matching those mechanics and doing more complicated things. And similarly, if one of your goals in getting into games is that you want to be more on the art side of things, then like, maybe you're focusing a lot more on making your own assets and, drawing your own little sprites or like whatever it is, because, those are very important skills to develop as well. If anything, I think I would probably encourage that anyone tries to build their own assets, at least for the early projects, just to kind of start understanding how game assets look, how they work, even if you're just pulling down some, there's all kinds of free assets available on sites like itch.io. Even if you're just kind of grabbing those assets and kind of like tracing over them and trying to kind of figure out how to make them your own and edit those assets and stuff like that, like I think that's all very good, useful skills and knowledge to have as well. But again, keep in mind what your goals are. So for me, I'm going to kind of mix and match what I have available for me because that's convenient, because I'm not necessarily trying to develop my art skills at the moment. We're trying to learn about game development, so that's what I'm trying to kind of focus on here. Trying to focus on what are your goals and what can you do. The long and short of it is that you're basically trying to kind of create a simple project that is achievable, that is appropriate for your skill level, that like, if you look at the list of things that you need in order to finish this project, it's not going to be like a million long. So the idea is, we're just trying to kind of think about it a little bit before we get ourselves in too deep. We're not trying to design the whole game right here and now, but we're just trying to kind of make sure that we know what we're getting ourselves into. But also, after this, we're going to start picking a game engine. And so based on what we decide our project is going to be very important for that process as well. So with all of that rambling out of the way, what are we actually going to be building? Like I said, I think you should design your project around what's right for you. But for the purposes of this tutorial series, I'm going to try and come up with something very basic that we're going to build in future videos. And so if you don't know what to build, then feel free to build this along with us. So let's start thinking about what we want to build and what we need to actually complete that project. I think first and foremost, obviously, our video game needs like a little player person. So we need, and we need to be able to move around. Maybe that's not a given, but I think, those are pretty much every project needs that. So I think we can say movement is a pretty good place to start from. And then another good one is just, maybe you have item pickups, whatever this is. So this is, the process of picking up an item is in itself, a little bit more complicated and requires other stuff, but we can just say pickups. And what are we actually doing with those pickups? Well, it's important for a video game to have a win state. So maybe we can say that, if we get, say, 5 of these, then we win the game. So this is our victory condition. We need a way to kind of win the game, and that's, in a way, that's kind of what makes it a game. But more so than that, I think one of the things that we're trying to kind of say with this specifically is that we want to kind of start thinking about what is the full game loop, and how do we kind of like start the game, how do we end the game, what happens when we win, where do we go, all these kind of things. Because learning how to do all those things is very, very important for actually completing projects, rather than just kind of like making endless tech demos where your guy just kind of moves around and does something, right? So, this is a very basic concept that we have here. We just have a guy who kind of picks up a bunch of stuff. So I talked a little bit about, art assets and theming and stuff like that. So maybe let's start thinking a little bit more about that side of things, and we can start thinking about how to inject theme into our game and kind of where to add the fun, where we can kind of start feeling the theme and kind of understanding what the victory condition is and why we're trying to do it, and kind of understanding what the game loop is, even on this very simple project that has almost no mechanics to it. So for myself, I mentioned that I kind of looked at the assets that I have available to me, and I kind of decided that a farming game would be something that I could make using the assets available to me. So that's kind of be kind of the wrapper that we look at these things with. So if you say, maybe this guy's like a little farmer, and potentially these pickups could be, things that farmers pick up. So, effectively we think of farming as, I think, planting plants, taking care of plants, and harvesting those plants. So maybe instead of just collecting 5 things, maybe the goal is, maybe we've got a little farm, and then maybe we have to plant seeds in order to grow them. Once the seeds grow, that's when we get the points. And so, this is adding a lot of complexity to what we already have, but it's adding a lot in a layer of kind of like gameplay mechanics, where we can start looking at how do we actually make this fun? How do we make it so that the interactions that the player is doing actually mean something, rather than just kind of like arbitrarily increasing a number and stuff like this. So if we want to kind of like add this level to it, we can say that farming requires planting seeds. Planting, watering plants, harvesting. And even this on its own, this is already kind of quite the list of things to look at for our very first game. So, already, within just a couple of minutes of planning, we've already kind of arrived at a level of complexity that, like, we really don't need to go any further than this. So, like I said, it is very important for your first project to kind of aim small. Try and make it simple and achievable. So, feel free to kind of have fun and make it your own, and, you don't have to do exactly this or whatever, make whatever project inspires you. But for the purpose of this tutorial, this is what we're going to be making. Which brings us to the next question of, what engine are we using to make it in? another very common question from beginners and stuff like that is, what engine should I learn? What is the good engine? And it's a question that there is no one answer. It's always going to be a question of, every engine has its own strengths and weaknesses, and what engine you're working in is going to kind of it should be determined by your goals as a developer, as well as how well suited the engine is to your particular project. So let's break that down a little bit. Maybe starting with the second one is, if you're thinking about what are your goals and how they relate to your game engine, if you're learning one of these engines on the bottom, like RPG Maker, experience in RPG Maker isn't necessarily going to help you get a AAA job making FPSs in Unreal, right? So, think a little bit about what engines are in demand and what you're trying to do with them, and especially if you are trying to take this in a professional direction, what kind of engines people like to see on portfolios. But aside from that, I think it should be mostly about what engine is good at making the kind of game that you're trying to make, and also, how well you get along with the workflow of that engine and how easy it is to use and stuff like that. So, these are certainly not all of the engines that are available out there, but let's kind of take a look at some of them and kind of talk a little bit about what those strengths and weaknesses are. First off, we have Godot, which is, I don't know if it's the newest engine in the list here, but it's kind of risen to prominence in the last few years, so to speak. And it's kind of an engine that has grown to prominence a little bit more so in like the hobby space and stuff like this. It's an engine that's very lightweight, it's very easy to use, and I would say it's quite good for beginners. It's kind of targeted at these smaller games, is kind of what I would say. It's very, very good for 2D and stuff like that. If you're trying to learn, there's a lot of resources available to you, even down to things like a lot of the information you need to learn how to use Godot is in the engine itself. You can just open up the documentation from directly in the engine. There's lots of good tooltips and stuff like that. So I think Godot is a very good option for you. And in particular, we know that the farming game that we're trying to make is a 2D game, and so it feels like Godot is an engine that kind of hits all of our goals that we've established. At least maybe your goals are different than what we've kind of talked about so far. But like if we're trying to make this farming game, then this is sounding good so far. As far as downsides, a lot of it is kind of more so on the usability side of things. Godot is a newer engine. It's not as professional as some of the other engines that are out there. And so it's kind of missing some of these features. It has a little bit less quality of life stuff. The editor kind of frustrates me a little bit sometimes and stuff like that. And also, kind of like we were talking a little bit, maybe this doesn't matter to you too much, but at the moment, there's not really many jobs where, like, if you learn Godot, you're probably never going to get hired for your Godot knowledge necessarily. A studio is probably never going to be looking for a Godot developer, at least based on the current industry trends and stuff like that. So it's the kind of thing where if you're just making games for fun, for a hobby, if that's all you're kind of interested in, and you're just kind of learning, I think Godot is a great place to jump in. But it's maybe not necessarily as good for your kind of long-term prospects, is what I would say. And moving on to Unity, we have not an entirely different story here. One of the biggest differences compared to Godot is, I think, this side of things, where Unity's editor is a lot more robust than Godot's. It has a lot of features that make things like debugging very easy. Unity's the kind of game engine where basically no matter what you want to build, you can build it in Unity, and it's probably going to be a little bit annoying to build it, but you absolutely can do it. And, a lot of that comes down to the fact that Unity is an engine that's been around for a really, really long time now, and has always benefited a lot from a lot of community support and stuff like that. So there's tons and tons and tons and tons of tutorials and documentation and plugins and the asset store and all this kind of stuff out there that is kind of help ease your process along the way if you kind of want to make something that's a little bit bigger, a little bit more complicated. Or, you can make small, simple games in Unity as well, no problem. Ultimately, Unity is the kind of engine where it's you can make whatever you want. It's probably never going to be a bad choice for you. But it kind of pays the price a little bit. The downside to being fully featured is the fact that there's a lot of bloat in Unity. There's a lot of stuff, especially if you are making 2D games like us, there's a lot of stuff in Unity that we do not need, we do not care about, and that is just going to slow us down. Even when it comes to things like opening the engine, compiling every single time you want to compile, like you're going slower because of the bloat. And similarly, being around a long time kind of works against Unity in some ways, in that, like, despite how many features there are, a lot of them were kind of like, they threw out like an alpha version of the feature and then completely abandoned it. Unity is a commercial product, and so they're always going to be kind of chasing new fancy features that are going to attract people to their engine and say, like, you want to spend money on Unity so that you can access this feature, and it's not really generally worth their time to kind of like continue supporting that feature in a significant way after the fact. So that's kind of one of the downsides of Unity, is like, especially if you are doing big, complicated games that require these features, then that can be a big downside as well. Also, a downside to being versatile is the fact that the way that Unity handles 2D is very strange. So, this is a definite downside for our project. But again, it is the kind of engine where, like, you absolutely can do it. There are countless, many games that use Unity to make 2D games. And so, you definitely can do it. It just takes a little bit of thinking outside of the box in some ways. Which brings us to Unreal. If kind of the last couple of engines were the more like accessible side of things, Unreal is very much on the other side of the spectrum. Unreal is the kind of engine that is aimed more so at like big AAA teams who are making very complicated projects that need a lot of speed, that need a lot of compute power and stuff like this. Like I said, it's a very powerful engine. It's good for 3D and multiplayer, and it's the kind of engine where it takes a lot of setup, but you get a lot out of it in the end of the day. So, like, if you are trying to make a 3D game, then Unreal makes it very, very easy for you, but there is still a lot of hoops that you have to jump through and kind of stuff to get there. It's also the case that the blueprint system is very powerful, and so if you're someone who's intimidated by programming, that's something that might appeal to you. I would say that visual scripting is basically just programming anyways, so your results may vary. And finally, as the industry standard, like, there's probably always going to be jobs for people who know Unreal, at least if Unreal ever gets dethroned, which I don't know that there's any indication that that's ever going to be the case. So, if you are someone who is gunning for a actual job in the games industry, Unreal is a very good choice for that. But it's a very complex engine. It's very slow to make anything in it. And the engine itself is runs very slowly. So if you have a poor laptop or something like that, there's a good chance you won't even be able to open the program. And so, these are all downsides as well. And stuff like 2D doesn't have the greatest support in Unreal. Like I said, it's kind of aimed at these kind of AAA shooter console games, more or less, is kind of what it's optimized. You can do these, 2D games and stuff like that, but yeah. And ultimately, like, this is the kind of game engine where you kind of just have to know how things work. So, if you are someone who has been, using Unreal for a really long time, then, like, it's kind of not an issue. But unlike things like Unreal and Godot, it can be very difficult to kind of like figure out what is even going wrong, why things are not working. And you kind of have to have a lot of this kind of game industry knowledge before you even jump onto Unreal if you want to see any kind of success, really. And finally, that kind of brings us to almost like another class of engines, is what I would call it. We have Game Maker Studio, we have Construct, and we have RPG Maker and stuff like this. And these are almost the exact opposite of Unreal, where, if we can think of Unreal as an engine that is very permissive, that is very powerful, that allows the user to do basically whatever they want, and gives them a lot of tools to do it at a very, like, deep level. These are game engines that are focused on doing something very, very specific, like, making RPGs. And it doesn't give you a lot of ability to kind of like do things outside of that. So it's it gives you a lot of like kind of quality of life things that make doing these tasks very easy, but you're kind of limited to, every RPG Maker game looks pretty similar to every other RPG Maker game. Obviously there's exceptions, but that's kind of how it works. And similarly, like, Game Maker Studio is not quite as narrowly defined as being just RPGs and stuff like that. But it's kind of like, if you're not making kind of like a 2D sprite-based game, then Game Maker Studio is probably not something that I would ever consider. So, these are not bad options to get started with, just because that simplicity makes them much easier to learn, and generally it's easier to kind of accomplish whatever you're trying to do with these engines. But the downside is the fact that these are so specialized that, like, these are not games that generally are going to look that amazing on your resume unless they're, something that finds, like, commercial success or something like that. Because, like, these are generally not the kind of skills that people are looking for unless... So, like, these are the kind of engines that I would personally only consider if you want to make games for yourself, and your only goal is you kind of want to have fun and mess around, and you don't really have any ambitions of taking these skills and kind of, like, using them on bigger projects, anywhere else in your life, really. Like, if you learn how to make games in Construct, that's all you're really learning. These skills are not really that transferable ultimately. And so based on all that, I think the conclusion is that for our project, we're going to be using Unity. It's kind of just a nice in-between option. I mentioned a lot about how, like, Godot is actually a really good engine and would be a very good fit for this particular project. The problem with it is that Godot is a little bit smaller engine, is a little bit simpler engine, and the scope of what it can do and the prospects that it has for you long term are not as much so as Unity. Unity is an engine where people are still hiring for these jobs. There's still lots of people who are interested in making things in Unity and who are looking for those skills. It's also the case that if you develop your Unity skills, you can ultimately, eventually you're going to get to the point where you can make whatever game you want to make. So, like, I think this is ultimately an engine that you would probably not feel bad about investing into. I said how it's, like, a very versatile engine, so, like, it's definitely something that has downsides for our particular project. But as we're moving forward as developers onto the next projects beyond this, it's more likely that Unity is going to kind of give us the things that we need in order to be, like, successful developers. I would say that it's also very much the case that, like, feel free, you don't have to pick one engine forever and stick to only that engine. Like, I think it's good to kind of mess around with all of them, and if you find that, what, Godot really does kind of click with me way better. I kind of hate the way Unreal or Unity works, so, it's perfectly valid to say, like, Godot is what we're going to go with, because it's just that is what works with my brain. Like, it's a very personal decision, and ultimately, as long as your game is good, like, it's probably going to give you the kind of success that you're looking for. But I think ultimately, if we're looking to build our skills and kind of grow as developers, I think Unity is a very good option for that specific. And yeah, that's that. This video ended up a little bit longer than I expected for just the intro. But at this point, I think, I have hopefully kind of gone over a lot of kind of like what the motivations for this tutorial series are going to be, what you can expect to get out of it, what we're going to focus on, kind of the directions we're going to go. And now that we kind of know what we're building for this first project and what engine we're going to be using to do it, we can kind of, in the next lesson, we can start thinking about how we're actually going to go about that, start building an action plan as far as how we're going to actually, like, implement all of our mechanics and stuff like that, and just start building. We're going to start learning how to make a video game. And so, hopefully you stick around for that next episode, but for now, catch you later. Thanks for watching.